We're in the Gospel of Mark, and we are in chapter 12. 4 questions. If you were going to a Passover meal, and I'm sure that wasn't always the same by everybody who talks about it, but according to some writings, if you went to a Passover meal, after they would read the law, there would be a series of 4 questions. And at least one rabbi says that the 4 questions would be something like, and they tell a story, the 4 questions sometimes would come from 4 kids. The first son asks a question about the law. Second child who's more impious asks an impious question. The third one asks some simple question. And then the fourth one, according to one of the stories, the fourth youngest kid couldn't think of a good question, so the teacher just gave his own question to the crowd. I bring that up because in Mark 12, Jesus he's in the temple courts, and there are 4 questions. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that Mark is trying to help us see something to put in the place of the kind of traditions that you've gotten used to. If the temple has already been announced as the kind of place that God is going to bring an end to, that raises all kinds of questions. What about all these stories? What about the law? What about all the ways in which we built our life around this place? What would it look like to build our life around Jesus? I think that's why Luke is very careful, maybe more so than Mark. Luke, in the book of Acts, kind of helps us slowly transition. If you remember, the early Christians, right after Acts 2, the early Christians, they're not just meeting house to house, but also in the temple courts. And so we meet where we're used to meeting, and we extend beyond that. Here we have stories that remind us of what it would be like at the Passover, revolving your stories around the law. But now we're transitioning. What does it look like when you think about centering your life on where God is? What would it look like to center it around Jesus? At the end of Mark 11, the text says that as they came to Jerusalem, he was walking into the temple. The chief priests, the scribes, and the elders came to him and said, "By what authority are you doing these things?" I wanted to bring this up because of who's asking it. The chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Keep that in mind because I want us to fast forward for a second and go to verse 13 of chapter 12. Some of the Pharisees and then some of the Herodians try to trap him with a question. Now that one in verse 13, that's the first of the 4 questions in chapter 12. But I want you to see, so far, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders have asked him about his authority. Then the Pharisees and the Herodians show up to ask him about his authority. In verse 18, the Sadducees show up to ask him some questions. In verse 28, one of the scribes comes to ask him a question. I feel like Mark has covered everyone you can think of who's thought of as a major player in knowing the law or knowing what God would have his people do or be. And they're all challenging Jesus. Well, we'll get to whether or not the scribe does in verse 28. But they're all, some way, standing as alternatives to Jesus. And Jesus levels the playing field with them all. Chapter 12. He begins to speak to them in parables, and he says, a man planted a vineyard. And he put a fence around it. He dug a pit for the winepress. He built a watchtower, and then he leased it to tenants, and he went to another country. And when the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants to collect from them his share of the produce of the vineyard. But they seized him. They beat him. They sent him away empty-handed. And again he sent another slave to them. This one they beat over the head and insulted. Then he sent another, and that one they killed. And so it was with many others. Some they beat, others they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, they will respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they seized him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it's amazing in our eyes. And when they realized he had told this parable against them, they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd. So they left him and went away. If you're looking for some background to this story, one of the first places to start is Isaiah chapter 5. The vineyard. The vineyard is a phrase used in Isaiah for Israel. God's people is God's vineyard. Jesus is going to seize on this idea in the Gospel of John when he tells his disciples, "I am the vine, and you are what? You are the branches." By the way, side note, but just so you know, I've heard us sing songs. I think it's one of our songs, "I am the vine, you are the branches." When I say us, I don't mean West Side. I just mean in general, growing up, I remember hear that song. I've heard that phrase used, and it's often used in ways that sound very good and happy and exciting. He's the vine, we're the branches. That sounds great. But in John, I want you to realize what he's getting at. This is in the context of getting ready for martyrdom. And his point is, if I'm the vine and you're the branches, and they cut the vine, what happens to the branches? Yeah, they're going to die too. Just so you know, it's not a real happy story. But his point is, what they do to me, they will do to you. What happens to me is going to happen to you. But also the power that's flowing through me to endure is going to flow through you. And when God raises the vine, you better believe the branches are going to have a future as well. So there's a lot going on there. Back to the point. Mark chapter 12. Their background here for Israel is Isaiah chapter 5. Israel is God's vineyard. I don't think that would have been lost on the leaders when he says, there's a guy who has a vineyard, and he's a landowner. But then you add to that he puts some people in charge of his vineyard, and he sends people to check up on the work, and they seize them, they beat them, they send them away empty-handed, they hit them over the head, they have insults, they kill some, and then he goes out of his way to specify in verse 5, some they beat, others they killed. Now, we can read ahead. They did not have that ability to read ahead. But in Mark 13, he's going to specifically say, this is the story of what you've done in the past for when I've tried to send people to you. I'm thinking of Matthew's version. Let me see where that is in Mark. I might be thinking of Matthew's version. In Matthew 23, which is just before Matthew 24, obviously, but Matthew 24 is a parallel to Mark 13. In Matthew 23, Jesus says, over the years, how long I've wanted to gather your children together. Like a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you weren't willing instead. I've sent you prophets, I've sent you wise men, and some of them you stoned, and some of them you beat, and some of them you killed. This is the end of Matthew 23. That's almost a word-for-word equivalent to what he says here about what they do to the people at the vineyard. Some they insult, some they beat, some they kill. This is a reference to what's happened over the years when God has tried to send people to Israel to get them to shape up. And what happens to God's prophets? They aren't respected. And then he says, I still have somebody left to send, verse 6, a beloved son. They will respect my son. Now, if you're listening to this and you think, well, vineyard usually is Israel, sending people to help Israel and they not getting listened to, sounds like somebody saying the prophets weren't respected by the folks inside Israel, and now he's sending the son. this sounds like a messianic parable about what happens when God sends his own son, the Messiah. That's what everybody's saying Jesus claims to be. So you can see why in verse 12 they realize this parable is about them. Who is it who's going to reject the Son? Well, it's got to be the people who have been given charge of taking care of the vineyard. Remember, Ezekiel makes it clear the leaders of Israel are the watchmen. Their job is to watch out for what happens to Israel. Surely they'll respect my son, but the tenants say to each other, this is the heir. Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. Now that sounds a little silly to us. Who would do that? Believe it or not, and this is not an area that I know much about, but you go to the library and you find people who write books who do know about this. Duncan Derrett wrote sort of the groundbreaking book on how people thought about the law in the time of Jesus. And Derrett says that it was actually kind of a known understanding of something we might call squatters' rights. And that is, there was something in the laws that said, because some people owned lots of land and they had lots of things to care of it, and sometimes they forgot which land was theirs, that if you were in land and you could prove you had been there for a good length of time, you could go to court and with relative ease get the grant that says this is your land. So the argument of let's kill the son, he's the only one who is the rightful inheritance of the land. What happens if the father dies and he's got one son and the son's already dead and I've been on the land for 5 years? Good chance I could go to the court and get the land for myself. So you can see why this might be something that would make sense in that culture. So they say, let's kill the son, the inheritance will be ours. They seize him, they kill him, and they throw him out of the vineyard. It's interesting that they throw him outside the vineyard. You remember that Jesus, when he's crucified outside the walls of the city of Jerusalem. Hebrews says, let's go outside the camp and bear the burden he bore. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He'll come and destroy the tenants. He'll give the vineyard to other people. In Matthew's and other people's versions, I get Matthew and Luke mixed up on this, and one of those, he puts it to them. What do you think? What do you think the owner should do? In Mark's version, Jesus just says it. He'll come and destroy the tenants. He'll give the vineyard to others. You got to remember what's happening here. Jesus is just blowing up the whole way people see the world. I don't know a great illustration that would be equal to this. Maybe you can think of one and you can share it. But you got to understand, their whole world is being rocked if Jesus is right. In the Old Testament, the book of Job, Job says to his 3 friends, he's going through so much torment. His 3 friends come and they sit with him in silence for 7 days. I want you to know that was the brightest time of their life when they said nothing. Because then they all begin to speak. And they all put their foot in their mouth because for 7 days they sit there with Job and they say nothing. They just enjoy fellowship with this hurting brother. And then they begin to speak and they say, all right, Job, let's just figure this out. Clearly you did something wrong because this is the way the world works. God punishes people for bad things. He blesses people for good things. If you're good, God blesses you. If you're bad, God curses you. This is how it works. You're cursed, so clearly you did something wrong. Job says, I didn't do anything wrong. So the next one gets up. Let me say it differently. God blesses those who do good. God curses those who do bad. Clearly you're cursed, so you must have done something wrong. Job says, I didn't do anything wrong. Elihu gets up. He gives a very long, beautiful speech. And at the end, he says, but basically, remember, God blesses those who do good, and God curses those who do bad, and you're cursed, so clearly you must have done something wrong. Job says, I didn't do anything wrong. And I love this line, and it's in one of these more contemporary versions, but the way it's worded really gets to the point. That one of them says, Job, why are you turning the world upside down? Well, you know what's really happening. If Job is right, that it's possible to be faithful, to be righteous, and to still suffer, then that would turn their world upside down. I wouldn't be able to make sense of life anymore. I've got my system and it works. What's happening to you doesn't fit my system. Okay. These people have spent not just their own lifetime, but their fathers and their fathers' fathers' fathers have been saying, the Gentiles are the bad guys. They're in God's holy land. They've taken over. The Messiah is going to come and clean house, get rid of the bad Gentiles, and then we, the faithful Jews who are following under the teaching of the Pharisees, and the Pharisees who are the watchmen of the vineyard, we are going to reign with him in his kingdom over all the bad guys. That's the story. And from the time they started meeting Jesus, the reason why they've been plotting to kill him since chapter 2 or 3 is because Jesus has been saying, God's coming to build a table in his kingdom, and he wants you there, and he wants that oppressing Gentile over you there, and he wants you to eat together as brothers. And he's not coming so that he can destroy all these people tomorrow. He's actually going to die so that in his death, you can be forgiven, and so can those very people that you want me to crush. I don't want to crush them. I want to save them. And I'm going to open the floodgates. It turns out that if they had been reading their Bibles carefully, they would have seen this all along. Back in Genesis chapter 12, God comes to Abraham. And the way that so many people read it, the way they thought they read it, the way they would have said it to their kids probably was, God came to Abraham and God said to Abraham, I'm going to bless you so much that through your seed, I'm going to bless all future Israelites. But that's not what God said. God said, through your seed, I'm going to bless the whole world. It was always God's plan, Genesis 12:3, that he's going to have a people through whom he would bless the whole world. So what he was saying is, I don't want you to be a well. I want you to be an aqueduct. I want you to be a system that allows all the blessings that come to you to bless the whole world as a result. But they kept drawing the circle narrower and narrower. So narrow that it even split down the line of Israel. If you went to the temple, you'd have to pass through different courts. And depending on what you looked like, you could only get so far. There's the court of the Gentiles, and you got to stop. There's the court of women, you've got to stop. There's the court of the average Jew. There's the court of the priest. There's the high priest. And so there's these lines and layers. It's not what Jesus wanted, not what God wanted. And so the story of the Messiah's coming, but it's not going to look the way I thought it was going to look. In fact, it's the opposite of the way I thought it was going to look. It's too much for them to bear. Do you remember when Jesus showed up to give his first sermon? Luke 4. He's in the synagogue, and he reads from Isaiah, and he sits down and he says, guess what? Today's your lucky day. That's my paraphrase. He says, today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. And they're very excited because the verse says, this is the year of the Lord's favor. Well, I want the year of the Lord's favor. What does it look like when God shows up to give favor? Jesus gives two examples. Does anybody remember the two examples Jesus gives of what it looks like when God shows up to give his favor in Luke 4? If you don't remember the specifics, do you remember the kind of people who get the goods in the Old Testament that he refers to? Are they insiders or are they outsiders? Outsiders. I heard somebody whispering. You can say it out loud. Outsiders. His two examples are where God's Israelites were hurting. He actually says that. There were many widows in Israel in those days. And who did God show up to? A widow over in Zarephath who was needing some help. What does it look like for the year of the Lord's favor? It looks like a year where the Gentiles get blessed. And what do they want to do? What's that? Naaman, yes. Naaman the Syrian, yes. And what do the people do? they want to take him and throw him off the edge of a cliff. Yes, sir. Just 4 verses or something later. Because they're very excited if it means God's throwing blessings down the well. But they're scared to death. It blows up their world if what it means is God wants to open the lid. God wants to bless others. My enemies? He wants to bless my enemies? Well, keep reading. You'll get a clue that this is all part of it, because in the Sermon on the Mount, we learn about anger and lust and covenant keeping, and it ends in this ultimate one, which is to love your enemies. This is what it means to be one of God's children, to love even your enemies. And now he's saying, to top it all off, now he's saying God's going to take the kingdom, the vineyard, away from you, the leaders who are the watchmen, and give it to other people. Mark doesn't specify, but you can imagine that they're not just thinking you're going to appoint other Jewish people to be the leader of your vineyard. It could even be outside that circle, which just blows their mind. There are walls that separate the kind of people who can get close to the center where God is. And God is saying, actually, you need to look way out there to kind of see where God is right now. He's with the hurting and the broken. He's with the people who are running to me. He's with the people who have been sitting at the feet of the Messiah. And all through the gospel, it has been some Jewish people, but it's also been Gentiles. It's been the folks who could never get close to the center of the temple courts, the blind and the lame, the prostitutes and the tax collectors. That's who he's been going after. The kingdom is going to look very different. The vineyard is going to look very different. They realized he had told this parable against them, and they wanted to arrest him. But they feared the crowd, so they left him and they went away. They've been trying to do this for a long time. But now they're thinking, let's see if we can trap him. Let's see if we can get the crowd that we're afraid of riled up so that maybe they'll do our dirty work for us. So verse 13, they sent to him some Pharisees and some Herodians to trap him in what he said. I just want to stop here. The background here is important because this verse is supposed to make your jaw drop. Who are the Herodians? Okay, I'll give you a hint. It's Herod with Ians after it. Think about Christians. Christ with Ians after it. A Christian is somebody who follows Christ, sees Christ as their Lord, wants Christ to be in power. Herodians, the same thing. They follow the Herodian line. They want the Herods to be in power. They think the Herods have authority, and they want it to stay that way. Guess who the Pharisees are? The Pharisees arose as the anti-Herodian group. The Pharisees arose as the ones saying, who are you to have authority over Israel in Israel's land? We'll go to death over it. And the Pharisees and the Herodians say, one thing we can agree on, this Jesus guy has got to go. I asked my class one time, I said, I need an example of two people that would never get along, but they finally get along because they see a common enemy. Name people on opposite ends, and they're all quiet. And one person said, LeBron fans and Michael Jordan fans. I said, okay, that's pretty good. We'll go with that one. They agree. They join forces to say at least basketball's better than, baseball or some other terribly anti-Christian thing to say. All right. I'm just kidding. Baseball is God's favorite sport. You know that, right? I mean, in the big inning, he created. Okay, I'm sorry. That was bad. They come to him and they say, Teacher, we know you're sincere. You show deference to no one, for you don't regard people with partiality. You teach the way of God in accordance with truth. Every word of that is true. But remember, the verse before it says the Pharisees and the Herodians are working together, and they were trying to trap him. And the verse after it says he understood their hypocrisy. So please don't read this as a sincere statement. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Okay. I don't like to insert my opinion. There's no way to teach without doing that occasionally, but please understand, this is my opinion. I don't believe that this section is real helpful in answering the question, should Christians pay taxes? I do think it's a good question. I think the Bible helps us. I'm not saying it's not impossible you can draw something from it, but please remember, they're trying to set him up. And the way Jesus often responds is to turn the tables by trying to set them up. In other words, it's really not about taxes. They bring up about taxes. His answer isn't so much about taxes as to try to trip them up for what they're trying to do. What he says is true. It may be that what he says is an exact answer to the question. I'm just saying, don't just assume that that's the case. So the question is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? There's a background here. There was a poll tax that was put in place in 6 AD. And the poll tax was imposed on the people of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. And it was a hot button debate at that time. Because you have people saying they have no right to charge a poll tax. So I think that the question here is, can we get Jesus to answer? Because if he answers, yes, I think it's right to pay the poll tax, then the nationalists here, the folks who are strong supporters of Israel's sovereignty, are going to be very upset. The crowd that seems to be friendly to him, the crowd that laid the palm branches down as he entered the city. If I can get them to turn on him, then we don't have to do the bad work. They'll turn him over. But if he says, no, you're not supposed to pay taxes to the emperor, well, now we've got maybe a insubordination to the emperor, to the throne. Now that we got the other side, that maybe we'll find a reason to arrest him. So they think they got him trapped. Knowing their hypocrisy, he says, why are you putting me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me see it. There were lots of different kinds of money at that time. There's something interesting about revolutionaries and money. Every time there was a major change in government, they printed new money, and they put a new date on the money. So like when one person becomes in power, okay, then this is actually year 1 now with my face on it. That was a big deal. So there was Jewish money, there was Gentile money. There's all this stuff going on. There were copper coins that most people would use during the day if you lived in Palestine. Copper coins didn't have a face on it. Copper coins you could use for money. But the denarius was a silver coin, and it was Gentile money. It had a face on it. Now, just carrying around a coin with any human face was already against some forms of Jewish law. There's a reason for that. It was a very strict reading of the second commandment. Does anybody remember the second commandment? No graven images. So they didn't do that. But it's the height of trouble if you're carrying around an image that claims to be the image of God. Okay? So the denarius was an interesting silver coin. It had a picture of the Caesar on the front of it. And around his head, it said, Divius Caesar Filius. Filius Divius. So it said, the God Caesar, the Son of God. Okay? It was written all the way around his face. The coin actually said, he is God and he's the Son of God. And it had his picture on the front. Just having one of these, according to the strict reading of the law, was a defilement of the second commandment. And he's in the temple, the holiest place you can get to. And he says, anybody got a denarius? And they say, yeah, here's one. Okay? Interesting. Somebody's handling it. Somebody owns one. Somebody hands it to him. Okay, interesting. They bring him a denarius. Now, that already proves that the people he's talking to are already finding some way to balance this thing out about okay, I've got these loyalties to God, I've got these loyalties to the folks who are in charge, and I'm sorting it out. They're already in the middle of it. They're already mixed up in it. Okay. He looks at it and he says, I've got two questions for you. Whose head is this and whose title? Whose image is this and whose inscription? Man, there is so much going on here. There's double, triple entendre. Let's see if we can sort through it all. This is fantastic. Two questions. Because the picture is clearly the picture of a man. I mean, he was born. He had parents, flesh and blood. He's going to die. Clearly a man. But the title says God and Son of God. So the image is a man. The title is God. The big question is, are we talking about a man or are we talking about God? And he puts it back to them. Whose image and whose inscription? And their answer is, it's a man. So entendre number one. I've asked you if this is a God thing or a man thing. You've told me it's a man thing. Okay, great. What's the problem? Give men what belongs to men and give God what belongs to God. In other words, step number one is, you've told me we're dealing with a human being. Okay. Maybe we should treat our fellow man with whatever they deserve and treat God with what he deserves, but don't get the two confused. There's one thing he's done. But the second thing that he's done, whose image is this? If you go back to Genesis, every human being is made in the image of who? God. We're all made in the image of God. We should see our fellow man as an image bearer of God. So there's another layer here, which is everybody here bears the image of God, including Caesar. And we should probably treat every person as if we're dealing with somebody made in the image of God. So his answer can be applied in a number of ways. I've heard it applied flatly as, if your government tells you to pay taxes, you should pay taxes, but you should also give money in the collection plate at church. And maybe that's right. But I really think he's trying to bypass the whole question by saying, I want you to think about how you see God and how you see your fellow man, which is the two greatest commandments, which is going to get to in this chapter. I want you to think about that. They're setting us up for something. Who is God and who is your fellow man and how are they related? Because here's a coin that has an image of a man and says something about God. And on one hand, that's absurd because only Jesus is both. But on the other hand, why don't you see the image of God in everybody? And he says, okay, if you can separate them out, then you should give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, give to God the things that are God's. But the word for Caesar can also be the word for emperor, can also be the word for Lord, which is much more confusing. Third entendre. Fine. Give to the Lord what belongs to the Lord, and give to God the Lord what belongs to God the Lord. In other words, why don't you sort this out among yourselves? Who are you really serving? He's really leaving them with more questions than they came to him with. So much more going on. I mean, you carry his image around in your pocket. Clearly, you are already treating him as if he is something more important than the second commandment. And you're asking me about how to differentiate taxes. You don't even know who God is. You don't even know how to treat your fellow man. That's what I see in this passage. Let me stop here. What do you see in this passage? How can you help us read this better? Yes, sir.
I often appreciate the fact that when they ask you this question, simple question, but here we do yes, no. We never, like we often, we don't have to do it. We always find another.
Right. That's beautiful, Mickey. That sounds like an elder's talking right there. For those of you who didn't hear, he said, sometimes we feel like we're presented with issues as if there's only two options. And the truth is, if you step back and think about it, it may be better to answer in a way that shows third possibility and not think that everything has to fall into one of two options, which is often the way in which we find ourselves trapped. Anybody else with this story? Okay, the second question comes from the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection. I grew up in undergrad and in graduate school being told that the Sadducees only accepted the first 5 books of Moses. I may have said that to you a couple weeks ago. I've been trying to read every week and keep up. The latest commentary I read says there's no evidence that that's true. I've heard that my whole life. They say what we find is they certainly elevate the first 5 books of Moses. But as to whether or not they didn't accept the rest, that Josephus doesn't say anything about that, and he's really our only source. So I don't really know, but that's interesting. But I'd always been told they didn't accept anything but the first 5 books, so you can do your own research on that. But the point is, if you can make your argument from the first 5 books, now you've really got something, because that's what they emphasized. But they did not accept the resurrection. One of the reasons, there's probably a lot of reasons, but I'll tell you one reason. Wealthy landowners, which is what the Sadducees were, often had lowly poor tenants working their land. And what happens to lowly poor tenants hasn't changed much over the years. You watch movies about what happens on some of these large crop lands with a master who's got folks ruling over people who rule over people who rule over people, and the only rule is make sure I have a product at the end of the year. Bad things happen. You don't want to be a wealthy landowner and believe that folks who die in ways that are unjust are coming back. Because what they're going to do is point the finger. And that's one thing that would keep, I think, a Sadducee from wanting to believe in resurrection. The other is, if you're a rich, wealthy landowner, you have your reward. Belief in resurrection and belief in angels and afterlife implies obligation and debt, and maybe this isn't all there is. And you really live it up when you think this is my one and only shot. A lot of internal reasons not to believe in resurrection. And then third, they claimed you can't find that teaching in the first 5 books of Moses. Well, Jesus turns the tables on them. Jesus says, hey, I've got a question for you. Moses says in the law that if a man dies and doesn't have any kids, his brother is supposed to take the wife, and that's sort of, is he given heir? And Moses does talk about that. That was a way of trying to protect women in that culture. But he says, here's the story. The man dies, so she marries the brother. He dies, marries the brother. He dies. All the brothers, 7 brothers, they all die. Then she dies. Who is she going to be married to in the afterlife? Okay, may I suggest again, it may be that this passage gives us insight into questions about marriage and the afterlife and angels and how angels deal with others. And it may be that. I think everything Jesus says is true. But remember, this is the context where they're trying to trap him, and he's turning the tables on it. It is more focused on trying to show that they don't seem to understand the power of God with the resurrection. Everything he says is true. But I just want to be careful about how many layers we want to put onto this. And so Jesus says, you don't know the scriptures, you don't know the power of God. When they rise from the dead, he's challenging the core doctrine that separates them from the Pharisees. They don't marry, they're not given in marriage, they're like the angels in heaven. Number 2 thing he says that they don't believe in, angels in heaven. And as for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses? Well, what's the book of Moses? I've got Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus. I don't have a book of Moses. Does anybody know what the book of Moses is? Yeah, it's all 5. So Genesis through Deuteronomy is called the book of Moses. In the book of Moses, in the story about the bush, this is how people would talk in the synagogues because they didn't have chapters and verses. So he'd say, turn to the story about the bush, the burning bush. God said to him, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is God not of the dead, but of the living. You are very wrong. Okay, this is a syllogism. If you remember learning this in logic class. Syllogism is where if 2 statements are true, then the conclusion that follows has to be true. For example, all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man. Okay, if it's true that all men are mortal, and it's true that Socrates is a man, then what must follow is that Socrates is mortal. That's a syllogism. Look what he says here. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but the living. Therefore, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob must be living. It's a syllogism here. It speaks to two things, and I don't know which one is more powerful here, but it speaks to two things. One, something about the fact that there continues to be a relationship with God after you die. And number two, the fact that a future resurrection is really the outward appearance, the fulfillment of that which in God's mind is already true. That is, remember Jesus says, those who believe in me shall never die. That is, in some sense, in God's world, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are not dead and gone. They're present and alive. Verse 28, one of the scribes comes. This is an interesting passage, and I don't know exactly how to square it. When I say square, what I mean is the difference with how Mark does it with Luke and Matthew. In Luke and Matthew, it looks as if the scribe may be trying to test him. In Mark, it sure looks almost like he's on the right page. And in Matthew and Mark, Jesus asks them, what do you say? And in Mark, he just goes ahead and says it. When I say square, what I mean is I don't know if I had a video camera, what would I have seen? I don't know how to answer that. But what I can tell you is Mark is trying to put all the true answers on the lips of Jesus. It's possible to pass it back, but this is a case in which the true rabbi, the true teacher, is declaring the truth when those false rabbis are saying the lies. And so Jesus says, when asked, what's the greatest commandment? He says, hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. Love the Lord with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. There's no other commandment greater than these. You can find both of those commands in the Old Testament. But I also think it's interesting that these two commands not just end up being the most important, they end up summarizing all the others. I've never sat down and tried to count how many laws there are in the Old Testament, so I can't verify this. But for a long time, tradition said that there were 613 commands in the Old Testament. Can anybody guess? Are there more positive or negative? Negative. 365. They didn't have the same calendar, but for us that means one negative for every day of the year. Do not, something that we shouldn't be doing every day. And 248 positive. And they say, what's the greatest commandment? Yes, he has answers with the two greatest, but I think he also summarizes them all. And that's why in Matthew's version, Jesus says, on these hang all the law and the prophets. And so if you think about the 10 commandments, the big 10, the first 4 are about honoring God, and the last 6 are about honoring your neighbor. So these two are the most important. They also summarize all the things that God has said. If you want to know what a law is meant to point to, it's either about putting God first or loving your neighbor as yourself. And the scribe says, this is so right. And Jesus says, you're not far from the kingdom of God. It may be that this is an example of Jesus saying, even though I'm taking the kingdom away and giving it to others, there are some of you who are going to get it. Could be that. It could be a reference back to that verse about there are some standing here who won't taste death till they see the kingdom come with power. And he's saying, you're starting to get it. Or it could just be, like the rich young ruler, you're close but no cigar. I don't know exactly how to read it. Do you have any thoughts on that? It's certainly the case that his answer reveals that I get what's important. Because look at his answer. To love your neighbor as yourself is much more important than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices. Earlier in the chapter before that, Jesus goes into the temple and he overturns the tables where people are trying to do the sacrifices and the burnt offerings. That's what they're getting ready for. And this man recognizes what you want are clean hearts. What you want are lives where the ethic is about God and neighbor, not about filling my pockets. And then the fourth question is actually one that Jesus asks, which is David declaring about the Lord. And the question is, how can the scribes say the Messiah is the son of David when David called the Messiah Lord? It's meant to stump them about how they see Jesus. And then the chapter ends, and I've got 1 minute, with a wonderful conclusion to the chapter. Four questions that are meant to challenge the reigning leaders. And just like any good novel or any good movie, the camera turns to something that seems offset, something that isn't the center of attention. This poor widow who doesn't enjoy the rich landowner ability of the Sadducees, doesn't enjoy the status of the Pharisees, isn't known as a great teacher of the law or a scribe, just a poor widow who has 2 copper coins. My understanding is the copper coins made up 1/64th of a day's wage. Okay, let's add in inflation. Let's say that you make $10 an hour and you work 8 hours. That'd be $80. 1/64th is $1.25. I look like I did that in my head. I did in my office before I came in here. So, $1.25. She puts in 2 copper coins. It's all she's got. The rich are putting in lots of money. And my guess is, how does Jesus know that? Well, my guess is he's letting everybody know that I'm rich and look at me, look at all that I put in. This woman had 2 copper coins. I love that he says 2 because she didn't even split it up. She could have kept half to take care of her family. She puts them both in. Total commitment. And Jesus is sitting opposite the treasury, and he watches the rich give out of their riches, and he watches this woman, this poor widow, give 2 copper coins. This is all she's got, and she's got to live on this. $1.25. And she says, I'm putting them both in. Faith, commitment. This is tangentially related, but it reminded me of one of my favorite faith commitment stories I want to close on. A church was having a prayer service for rain. It had not rained for a while. It was an area where you needed the crops to grow. That's the people's livelihood. So they were praying for rain. And the guy gets up with tears in his eyes and he says, I know you all believe in the power of God. I know you do. But nobody showed it like this little girl sitting on the front row. She brought an umbrella. I love it. I love it. Here's this widow who's got 2 copper coins, and she's got to take care of her family. And she says there's nothing more important than letting God be God. God will take care. God will take care. I'm putting in all I got. And Jesus says, this is the kingdom. This is the story. And it's so different than the folks trying to question Jesus or trap Jesus or trying to hang on to their authority or wondering about the ruling powers and how to find their place in the ladder. This is a poor widow. Doesn't have any of that. It's not about power. It's about giving up the few things she has that would give her any sense of control, and gives it over to God. And he says, welcome to a story about the kingdom. Let's pray. God, we love you. We praise your name. We thank you for this class. We thank you for your word. We ask you to give us hearts on fire so that we will be your servants. We will do as you say. We will be known in our community as people who follow Jesus. God, we ask you to give us hearts that we might be like the scribe who recognizes the greatest commandments and like the widow who proves it by giving all that she has to you and trusting in you. God, we rely on your grace and your mercy. We ask you to give us tons of it in Jesus' name. Amen.